Hello and welcome. I'm James Ezimoha. You're watching A News. Let's see your headlines. Details of the new US-Iran ceasefire agreement are expected to be released in the coming days. G7 leaders hold high-level talks involving the United States, Ukraine, and the Gulf states. And President of Azerbaijan Ilham Aliyev meets U.S. Congressman Abraham Hamadeh in Baku. Now, details of the newly signed ceasefire agreement between the United States and Iran are expected to be released in the coming days ahead of a formal signing in Switzerland on Friday. The deal would reportedly extend the current truce and outline steps on sanctions relief, energy flows, and wider de-escalation framework.
The United States and Iran are expected to publish details of a new ceasefire agreement in the coming days, with a formal signing in Switzerland on Friday. The Memorandum of Understanding, signed this week but not yet made public, extends the current ceasefire by another 60 days. The reported 14-point agreement commits both sides to ending hostilities on all fronts. It also avoids new sanctions or military buildups. Under the framework, Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz to oil tankers and commercial shipping within 30 days. In turn, the United States would lift restrictions on Iranian ports and allow Iran to resume oil exports. Already there have been signs of loosening up of the Strait of Hormuz. At least 2 large oil tankers, run by state-owned National Iranian Tanker Company, reportedly moved past a U.S. naval blockade on Wednesday, the first shipment in nearly 2 months. They are carrying around 3.8 million barrels of crude oil. The deal reaffirms Iran's pledge not to develop nuclear weapons, which has been confirmed by U.S. President Donald Trump. However, discussions on Tehran's wider nuclear program will continue. Iran has maintained that its nuclear activities are for peaceful purposes. Officials from both sides say the deal could bring major economic benefits to Iran, including sanctions relief and access to frozen foreign assets. It also proposes a $300 billion fund, backed by Gulf states, to help Iran recover from war damage and losses, provided Tehran complies with the agreement. However, questions remain over Israel's role. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance said the agreement includes Israel and Lebanon, but Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel is not bound by the deal. Hezbollah has also warned that a lasting truce would be difficult unless Israel withdraws from southern Lebanon. The conflict has killed more than 7,000 people across the region, mainly in Iran and Lebanon. Meanwhile, oil prices fell to their lowest level in 3 months, as hopes grew that the agreement could ease tensions and improve stability across the Middle East.
Now, Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian says Tehran is prepared for all scenarios in the long-standing conflict with the United States. Both countries are seeking to avoid escalating tensions before they sign their peace agreement slated on Friday in Switzerland. Turaj Shivalelu has more.
Hosting on the social media platform X, Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian said that the final deal with the U.S. has not been achieved, stressing that Tehran is ready for all scenarios to serve its national interests. He added that as Iran prepares for all options, the country has learned from its leaders not to be humiliated. In the latest development following the ceasefire deal announced on Monday, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi spoke by phone with Omani Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi. According to official sources, they discussed the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding between Iran and the U.S., as well as bilateral issues. Oman has been one of the key mediators hosting indirect talks, as well as facilitating exchange of messages between Tehran and Washington. Meanwhile, the governor of Iran's central bank has announced that there are clauses in the peace agreement that ensure the unblocking of Iran's frozen funds. The semi-official Tasnim news agency quoted Abdul Nasser Hemmati as saying that factors were considered in deciding the provisions related to the release of assets. The bank's chief added that efforts have been made to ensure that the mechanisms in the agreement provide highest possible level of certainty for access to these financial resources. During the mediated ceasefire talks, Iran demanded the release of its funds, reportedly estimated at around $60 billion, that have been locked in countries including China, India, Japan, Qatar, South Korea, the UAE, and the US. Hemeti is currently in Russia to develop monetary and banking ties in the wake of Western sanctions against Tehran and Moscow. Turaj Shiralilu, reporting from downtown Tehran for A News.
In the last 5 hours, at least 4 people were killed and several others injured in Israeli drone strikes in southern Lebanon, according to Lebanese National News Agency. Despite a temporary peace agreement between the United States and Iran, fighting between Israel and Hezbollah continues. The Israeli military said it had struck a Hezbollah rocket launcher and targeted a suspicious vehicle near its troops. Lebanese authorities say more than 3,820 people have been killed and around 1.2 million displaced since the conflict escalated. U.S. President Donald Trump has criticized Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over Israel's attacks on Lebanon, saying he must act more responsibly. Speaking at the G7 summit in France, also said he was unhappy with Israel's handling of its military campaign.
We had a great relationship. We're talking about some end details. I didn't like that he did an attack based on there's a very minor little thing with some drones that were released, and he ends up doing I saw that attack. I saw where that bomb went. Did you see what happened? That was too much. Now, I'm not happy with the way Israel has handled themselves with Lebanon and with Hezbollah. They should have been able to do the job faster. It just goes on forever. And when that happens, it throws a negative light on the big deal, and that's the deal with Iran.
Now, witnesses say Israeli forces are expanding areas under their control in Gaza, with new markers and concrete blocks placed in parts of Khan Yunis and northern Rafah. Israeli tanks entered the Al-Tufar in northern Gaza City on Sunday, forcing several families to leave their homes, according to witnesses. Reuters footage showed yellow blocks positioned closer to residential areas. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the military should increase its control over Gaza from 60 to 70%. Israel and Hamas have yet to agree on the next stage of a U.S.-backed plan. Now, global tensions and shifting alliances are shaping discussions at the G7 summit in France as leaders focus on major international crises. The latest talks involving the United States, Ukraine, and Gulf states are taking center stage alongside economic and technological challenges. Ross Cullen has more.
The war between the US and Iran and the war between Russia and Ukraine formed the main bulk of the discussions here in Evian on Tuesday for day 2 of the G7 Leaders Summit. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and the US President Donald Trump sat down for one-on-one talks about the conflict, the Ukrainian leader urging his US counterpart to put more pressure on Russia, forcing President Putin to come to the negotiating table. That's the hope from Kiev. And in fact, Donald Trump did say that he would be reimposing certain sanctions on Russian oil shipments. And Donald Trump also said that he believed the US-Iran issue was disappearing into the, quote, rearview mirror, so he could spend more time refocusing back on trying to solve the war between Russia and Ukraine. Regarding the situation between the US and Iran and this memorandum of understanding that's due to be signed in Switzerland on Friday, Gulf leaders were also invited to Evian on Tuesday, and there were chances for them to have one-on-one sit-downs with Donald Trump, the leaders of Qatar, the UAE and Egypt, being able to further scrutinise the deal between Tehran and Washington, the impact on their region and the post-conflict situation regarding the Strait of Hormuz, which Donald Trump says will be completely open from Friday. On Wednesday, the final day of the G7 summit, the focus will look at global GDP. The French president, the host leader here, leading a charge to try to ensure that there is a more equitable sharing of global economic growth. And there will also be a session on the safety and deployment of artificial intelligence. Ross Cullen, A News in Evian.
Now let's talk to John Kavulik, senior editor of Issue Insight, who is attending the G7 talks in France to discuss the latest from the summit. Good to have you, sir.
Thank you.
Now, after 3 days of talks, did this G7 summit produce decisions that could actually change events or mainly political messaging?
Because I want to be the optimist and suggest yes, but the realist in me suggests no to not likely. The most reasonable statements by the G7 had to do with Ukraine, but everything else is couched in so many adjectives and adverbs. We will consider, we'll under advisement, we'll think about it, and there aren't any requirements. So I think coming out of this, President Macron will be happy because President Trump, although President Trump is soon to give a press conference, thus far he hasn't blown up at anyone, and it's, from an optical standpoint, operational standpoint, it's gone well, but not a whole lot of deliverables that will outlast the media cycle from this G7.
Mm-hmm. Now, from your perspective, did the leaders present a unified front or reveal deeper divisions among themselves?
Well, they presented a unified front in terms of how much they are deferential to Donald Trump, sycophantical to Donald Trump, sucking up to Donald Trump. Chancellor Merz of Germany, gave him a football jersey and then made sure the cameras saw it, and so it wasn't as cringeworthy as NATO Secretary General Rutte saying that about President Trump. Type of thing with NATO members, but that pretty much is the story, because every time they were in public, there was what's going to happen. There was this anticipation, is someone going to say something? Is he going to react? And generally, the 6 other leaders talked amongst themselves, stayed amongst themselves, interacted with him briefly, multiple times, but briefly. So I think that was their strategy, that we'll pop in, say a couple things, and then run away. So there's not any time for him to percolate with something.
Mm-hmm. Now, the G7 has long represented the world's leading economies, but as power shifts globally, is the group adapting quickly enough to remain influential?
No, not at all. President Erdogan of Turkey in 2023 in New Delhi at the G20, he said the world is larger than 5. He was talking about the 5 permanent members. It was kicked out in 2014 because of its invasion of Ukraine. And then you have the G20. And basically the cutoff for the G20 is $1 trillion in annual GDP. The G7 is anywhere from 32 trillion with the US, and it goes down from there. China isn't represented. And so if this is truly to be an economic forum, which is sort of what it started out to be, but there was always a political component. There was always the world's largest economies with democracy. And that's basically how it's rolled. But when you don't have the world's largest country by population, India, and the world's second largest economy and second largest country by population, China, you're just not representing the interests of everyone. And then you add to that, you have two representatives of the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission. They're representing their 27 members. But France, Germany, and Italy, members of the G7, are members of the European Union. So it's sort of like, what are they what are they doing? And that's like extra votes. So the G7 truly needs to be reconfigured. My guess is you're going to see President Trump reconfigure the G20. He hosted in December in Miami at his club. He's already pushed out South Africa. South Africa was always sort of an honorary member of the G20, but it wasn't nearly in terms of GDP. And South Africa was replaced with Poland. And ironically, Poland was basically 21. So now they're 20, and they do have $1 trillion economy.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned something about excluding countries, a country with the largest population size. Are the G7 countries moving toward cooperation now, or more divided global economy?
They're divided from each other with respect to particularly those three members that are members of the European Union. And then individually, they're more divided from the United States than they are from each other. And they're trying to sort of build a G7, but it's like G6 plus one, and the plus one would be the United States. But they also know they've got less than 30 months until President Trump is no longer President Trump. And a part of what we're seeing is they're trying to figure out, how do we get through these next 30 months? And in the next 30 months, you're going to have a G7 meeting in 2027. You're going to have one in 2028. So President Trump will be here for two more of them. They will shift twice during that time. Same with the G20. And they're going to try to figure out what they can do. They're going to watch the U.S. political landscape in November with the midterm elections. They're going to watch then how the Republican Party starts looking past Donald Trump, how President Trump reacts to all of that. Does he get more angry and more mean and more vindictive? I would expect the answers to all three of those questions are yes, he will. And so for the G7 or the G6, their goal is basically try to keep their heads down, but they do have to engage with this guy. And they do know that he's 80. He's now an officially old man. We've seen him acting sort of like an old man here. And they're going to have to figure out how to manage that. In some respects, he's like a toddler that has been potty trained, but sits at the table and is unable to yet control their emotions. And that's sort of what they're dealing with.
That was John Kavulik, senior editor of Issue Insights, joining us from France. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right, we'll continue with the main stories of the day after a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back to We're News. Now, Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev has met with U.S. Congressman Abraham Hamedeh in Baku for talks on bilateral ties, strategic partnership, and regional connectivity. Aliyev said Azerbaijan-U.S. relations have strengthened in recent months, pointing to strategic partnership charter and increased high-level engagement. The talks also covered Hamedeh's support for repealing Section 907, as well as cooperation in trade, energy, security, technology, and transport links, including the Trip Corridor and the Azerbaijan-Armenia peace process. Now, Kazakhstan is set to gain access to port infrastructure on the Strait of Hormuz under a new agreement with Iran. Our correspondent reports from Mamate.
Iran has completed the approval process for allocating a land plot to Kazakhstan at the Shahid Rajai port in Bandar Abbas, located on the Strait of Hormuz. The announcement followed talks between Kazakhstan's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of National Economy, Serik Shumangarin, and Iran's Minister of Roads and Urban Development, Farzaneh Sadek. Once the remaining procedures are completed, the site will be transferred to the Kazakh side. The ministers discussed transport routes and port infrastructure. Iran also confirmed its readiness to provide Kazakhstan with opportunities at the Chabahar port, which offers access to markets in South and Southeast Asia. According to Iran, the Zahedan-Chabahar railway is more than 90% complete. It's expected to become operational in the coming months, connecting the port to a rail network linking the Indian Ocean, Central Asia, and Europe. Kazakhstan also said it's ready to consider giving Iranian companies access to port facilities and terminals in Aktau and Kuruk on the Caspian Sea. The ministers also discussed the international north-south transport corridor. Freight volumes along the route rose by 12% last year to 3.5 million tons, while rail cargo traffic between Kazakhstan and Iran increased by 69%. Shumangarin proposed a joint roadmap to modernize transport infrastructure, which could raise the corridor's capacity to 20 million tons annually. Trade between the two countries also continues to grow. Bilateral trade rose by 26.4% last year to $430.2 million. Kazakhstan and Iran say they aim to increase that figure to $3 billion under the existing roadmap and the free trade agreement between Iran and the Eurasian Economic Union. Fariza Kalimursina, Almaty, A News.
Now let's talk to Togrul Kesking, professor at Chinese Institute of Arab States, Ningxia University in Almaty, Kazakhstan. Good to have you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Now, is this a breakthrough for Kazakhstan's connectivity ambitions?
Certainly, but I will make a institutional. I work at Ningxia University in China. I work also at Turan University in Kazakhstan. But Kazakhstan, basically, this is a very important development. Let's not forget, not only for Kazakhstan, for the entire Central Asia as a whole. Kazakhstan is the world's largest landlocked country, and for this reason, access to international port has always been strategic priority for the Kazakhstan as well as for Central Asian countries, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan. But through the cooperation with Iran, Kazakhstan gains an additional route to global markets. Let's not forget, especially toward the Persian Gulf, Indian Ocean, South Asia, Africa, and Middle East. And this agreement should be understood as a part of the Kazakhstan broader strategy for transport diversification. Under the President Tokayev, Astana does not want to depend on one route, one partner, or one geopolitical direction. Multi-vector policy based on. And instead, Kazakhstan is building multiple corridors through China, through the Caspian Sea, through the Caucasus, through Russia, and now more strongly through Iran. This is the logic of the multi-vector foreign policy applied to trade and infrastructure under President Tokayev.
Now, speaking about Iran, is Tehran becoming an indispensable country in to Central Asia's trade ambitions?
Yeah, I mean, Iran is historically, has been a very important place for the Central Asia, and influenced not just Central Asia, but also China. Let's not forget, one of the first Muslims in China converted to Islam through the Iranian traders, actually. But Strait of Hormuz, let's go back to Hormuz, is one of the most important maritime choke points in the world. It connects Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman and wider Indian Ocean. A major share of the global oil and liquefied natural gas trade passes through this narrow waterway actually, as we have seen last 3 or 4 months under the war between Israel, Iran, and the United States actually. But for the Kazakhstan, access to port infrastructure connected this region means more than just transportation. It means entry into the one world most important energy and trade zone. Kazakhstan is already an important energy producer, exporter, but its geography limits the direct access to open seas actually. Iran provides a southern gateway, and this could increase Kazakhstan's economic flexibility and geopolitical importance, not just for Iran, but for the entire new region for the Kazakhstan.
Now, speaking about trade connections, the North-South corridor is growing, but so is the Middle Corridor. Which route currently has the strongest momentum?
I mean, under the globalization, all routes are important, not just for the Kazakhstan, but for the entire region, from my own perspective. And there are several benefits for this. And first, this agreement can reduce transportation costs, unlike the Middle Corridor, and shorten access to markets in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Africa. And Kazakhstan export grain, metals, oil products, uraniums, and other strategic commodities in the world. These products need reliable and diversified transport routes. Second, this strengthens Kazakhstan's role in the international north and south transport corridor. This is not like a middle corridor, but this is a north and south corridor. And it will benefit Africa as well in this context, which connects Russia, Caspian region, Iran, India, and the wider Indian Ocean actually. Kazakhstan can become an important bridge between Eurasia and the Gulf in this context, unlike the middle corridor. Third, port access to Iran gives Kazakhstan more leverage in the global trade. When a landlocked country has several export routes, it becomes less vulnerable to sanctions, war, borders, closures, and political pressure from any single transit country. Whether China, United States, Russia, or Turkey, it doesn't matter. This is why transport diversification is also a form of sovereignty in this new globalized world, actually.
Let me get your thoughts on this. Could growing trade links ultimately matter more than political relationship itself?
I mean, for example, the Kazakhstan's foreign policy has always been based on balance since 1991. Balance between United States, China, and Russia and Turkey. These are the important players, and plus India, important players in Central Asia. But the European Union also. But agreement with Iran is a good example of that multi-vector strategy of the Kazakhstan new foreign policy. Kazakhstan is not choosing one bloc against another, rather is expanding its options. In today's world, power is increasingly connected to infrastructure, unfortunately. Logistic, energy routes, supply chains. Kazakhstan understands this very well, especially under the Tokayev, by developing access to Iranian ports. Astana increases its strategic autonomy and reduces overdependence on any single route, actually, including Middle Corridor, Russia, China, or the United States or Turkey. This is good for the Kazakhstan. This is good for the Central Asia, actually.
Speaking about what's good for Kazakhstan, what does Iran gain from bringing Kazakhstan deeper into its transport network then?
I mean, it's also important for the Iran. It's also important for the China. Let's not forget, it's also important for the United States. In order to have a more developed and more democratic, more economically balanced regions, especially Central Asia between Iran. I mean, for example, China is a very important in this context, connection to Iran. This Belt and Road Initiative, introduced by the Xi Jinping in 2013 in Astana, in Kazakhstan again, And in same year, Kazakhstan and Iran has made an oil deal for $70 billion connecting China and Iran. And this is the transformation of the Eurasia. China wants secure and diversified routes to Europe. United States wants to have, hopefully, more developed and democratic Iran and the Middle East. And Kazakhstan cooperation with Iran can complement China's broader connectivity vision. This does not mean Kazakhstan is simply following the China. Rather, Kazakhstan is using China's rise, Iran's geography, and its own central location to increase its strategic value. On the other hand, for Iran, Iran will benefit from this economically, politically, socially, as they used to have before in the history, actually, during the Silk Road. This is the revitalization of the Silk Road in the 21st century.
Now, let me get your thoughts on this. Could stronger Kazakhstan-Iran connectivity also reshape Azerbaijan's role in regional transport routes, particularly given the importance of the Caspian region?
Yeah, of course. I mean, Iran and Kazakhstan, they are part of the Caspian region and Caspian, the sea, basically, including Azerbaijan and other small countries, the Northern Caucasus. This will be beneficial for the all. Let's not forget. But there's also risk. For example, Iran is under sanctions, and Persian Gulf is highly sensitive geopolitical region in the world. Strait of Hormuz has often been at the center of the tension between Iran and the United States and Gulf states and other global powers. But as the President Donald Trump, the United States, mentioned today, if the Iran deal is made, entire region will be benefited from this actually. And on the other hand, any military crisis in the region can affect shipping, insurance costs, and investor confidence. And it will create underdevelopment in the region, basically. This will create radicalization and Islamization in the entire region, not just in Central Asia, but in the Middle East and Caucasus.
Thank you very much, sir, for sharing your time and insights with us.
Thank you very much.
Now, Russian attacks have killed at least 4 people in Ukraine's east and southeast, with damage reported across several cities. The latest strikes come as both sides reported overnight drone activity far from the front lines.
A series of Russian attacks on Ukraine overnight killed at least 4 people and wounded more than a dozen others, according to Ukrainian officials. Regional authorities of Zaporizhzhia said waves of Russian drones struck the city, killing 1 person in a car and injuring 7 others. A residential building and a shopping centre caught fire, while an educational institution was also damaged.
You can't move around the city freely. This is already, you see, my second time. The first time I was caught in the blast myself. I was on my way to work. And the second time it was with my family. You can't just calmly go out to the store.
In this case, what's happening now is simply genocide against our people, intimidation and things like that.
Officials said Zaporizhzhia was struck 5 times during the attack. Further east in the Donetsk region, prosecutors said Russian bomb attacks on Sloviansk killed 3 people and injured 5 others. The city is part of Ukraine's heavily fortified defensive belt and remains a key target in Russia's slow advance through the region. Meanwhile, Russia's defense ministry said its air defenses destroyed 157 Ukrainian drones overnight over several Russian regions and the Black Sea. Ukraine's military also reported continuing heavy Russian losses, saying Moscow allegedly has lost more than 1.38 million troops since the start of its full-scale invasion in 2022.
Now, Denmark is set to send 850 troops to Latvia this autumn as NATO continues to reinforce its eastern flank. The battalion will take over from Swedish contingent already stationed in the region. Denmark's defense minister said Denmark must play its part in deterring Russia, calling the security situation serious. The deployment comes as European NATO members face growing pressure to take more responsibility for their own defense. Now, the European Union is facing growing internal tensions with reports of an escalating power struggle at the top of its foreign policy leadership. Criticism is mounting against both EU foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen amid concerns over the future direction of the bloc's diplomatic agenda. Here's more.
A storm is brewing inside the European Union, with reports of a battle for control of EU foreign policy. Spanish newspaper El País reported on Thursday, citing diplomatic sources, that some diplomats are comparing a rivalry between EU foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to the television series Game of Thrones. The newspaper says there is growing dissatisfaction with Kallas's performance. Critics accuse her of focusing too much on the conflict in Ukraine, while paying insufficient attention to the Middle East. At the same time, von der Leyen is also facing criticism. According to El País, some diplomats accuse her of a constant drive to expand her influence over EU foreign policy. Meanwhile, Euronews reported that von der Leyen may be behind a diplomatic reform within the EU that could reduce Kallas's powers. The report says von der Leyen is increasingly making statements on foreign policy issues, effectively exceeding her authority and weakening Kallas's position. At the same time, however, France has proposed strengthening the role of the European External Action Service, which is headed by Kallas. According to a report by Reuters on June 11th, a document circulated in Brussels stating that giving Kallas more power would name to her role within the European Commission. Currently, she is one of the Commission's 6 executive vice presidents and shares responsibilities with other officials in several areas.
The situation remains fragile.
The situation suggests that Brussels' main challenge is no longer limited to external threats. A struggle for influence, leadership and authority at the highest levels of the European Union is becoming increasingly visible.
Now, as Armenia pursues a new path centered on peace, regional connectivity, and closer ties with the West, divisions have emerged over the country's future direction. This report examines the debate and the competing interests shaping Armenia's next steps.
The Armenian National Committee of America, or ANCA, describes itself as the largest and most influential Armenian-American grassroots advocacy organization in the United States. But as Armenia moves toward peace with Azerbaijan, its lobbying has raised a sharper question. Is ANCA supporting Armenia's future, or the forces resisting normalization? One of its most visible voices, Policy Director Alex Galitsky, has repeatedly criticized the August 8th Washington documents, portraying them as rewarding Baku and undermining Armenian interests. Yet the Washington track was negotiated by both Yerevan and Baku and presented as a step toward ending decades of conflict, opening transport links and stabilizing the South Caucasus. Organization has also opposed continued US waivers of Section 907, allowing military assistance to Azerbaijan, and criticized Washington-brokered talks with Baku. Together, these positions place ANCA not only against Pashinyan's peace agenda, but also against key elements of Washington's South Caucasus policy. The same pattern is visible in Armenia's domestic politics. ANCA's messaging increasingly overlaps with forces opposed to Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's course, particularly around Russian-Armenian businessman Samvel Karapetyan. After Karapetyan was detained in Yerevan, following his support for the Armenian Apostolic Church, ANCA Executive Director Aram Hamparian publicly defended him as one of Armenia's major philanthropists, employers and taxpayers. Karapetyan's name has also appeared in allegations surrounding Luis Moreno Ocampo's anti-Azerbaijan campaign. According to leaked recording materials, Russian-Armenian financial circles, including Karapetyan, helped fund Ocampo's advocacy, while money from Armenians living in Russia reportedly financed social media operations, diaspora mobilization, and pressure on Western media and politicians. Armenian lobbying networks in the United States, including those linked to ANCA, were also mentioned in this context. The allegations do not prove coordination, but they place Ankar's defense of Karapetyan inside a wider ecosystem of Russian-linked money, diaspora lobbying, anti-Azerbaijan messaging, and resistance to normalization. That context revives an older concern about Moscow's use of Armenian diaspora networks. Cold War-era material from the Mitrokhin archive shows that Soviet intelligence cultivated Armenian communities abroad, including in the United States, and treated diaspora structures as channels for recruitment, intelligence gathering, and political messaging. This does not prove a direct link to today's ANCA, but it shows that Armenian diaspora networks were historically viewed by Moscow as a field of influence. ANCA's alignment with anti-Pashinyan forces has also extended to the Armenian Apostolic Church, now a major center of opposition to the government. Leaked documents and audio recordings published by local media allege coordination between church figures and former officials to remove Pashinyan and derail the peace process. Against this backdrop, ANCA and affiliated activists framed government actions against church figures as political persecution. ANCA's regional messaging on Iran has raised similar questions. During the escalation involving Iran, Israel, and the United States, Galitsky described Iran as Armenia's neighbor and ally, and said it was being bombed indiscriminately by US-Israeli forces. For critics, that framing placed ANCA closer to the Russia-Iran axis than to Armenia's Western-backed normalization course. The question now is whether one of America's most powerful Armenian lobbying groups is using its influence to help Armenia move toward peace and independence, or to preserve the old order of conflict, dependency, and Russian-Iranian leverage in the South Caucasus.
At the Eurosatory 2026 Defense Exhibition in France, Armenia's defense minister held a series of meetings with leading European defense companies. The visit comes as Armenia continues a rapid expansion and modernization of its armed forces. In the meantime, Yerevan says it remains committed to the peace process with Azerbaijan. Here's more.
Armenia is accelerating its military modernization while publicly maintaining its commitment to the peace process with Azerbaijan, a development that is drawing regional and international attention. At the May 28th military parade, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan said the display included equipment from 7 countries alongside Armenian-made systems. These countries were identified as India, France, Russia, China, Iran, and Belgium. Defense officials also indicated that additional suppliers were involved but not shown publicly, suggesting a wider procurement network that may include the United States. India and France have become Armenia's key defense partners. India is now the largest new supplier of military equipment to Armenia, while France has emerged as its main Western security partner. Armenia's Defense Minister Suren Papikyan's visit to the Eurosatory 2026 Defense Exhibition in France highlighted closer defense ties between Yerevan and Paris. He met senior representatives of major European defense companies, including KNDS and Airbus, to discuss possible cooperation in industry and technology. The visit shows France becoming an increasingly important Western partner as Armenia reduces its reliance on Russia. Since the 2020 Karabakh War, and especially after the Russia-Ukraine war began in 2022, Yerevan has pursued a more diversified procurement strategy. Armenian defense analyst Leonid Nersesyan estimates that around 95% of the equipment shown at the parade was newly acquired, highlighting the scale of modernization. Officials say the upgrades aim to address weaknesses revealed in recent conflicts and improve overall defensive capability. However, critics argue that the type of systems being acquired raises questions about Armenia's long-term military posture. Tensions with Moscow have also added to the shift. Ahead of recent elections, Russian officials questioned aspects of Armenia's political process, and no formal congratulatory message followed Pashinyan's victory. This marks a change in long-standing diplomatic practice between the two allies. Armenia will also host the Eagle Partner 2026 joint exercises with the United States from June 17th to 25th, joined this year by France and Greece, focusing on international peacekeeping preparation. Taken together, Armenia is expanding and diversifying its military partnerships, citing defense modernization and deterrence in a changing security environment. Faster procurement shows a shift in security policy, while Yerevan still says it supports regional peace efforts.
All right, after the break, we'll continue with the main stories shaping the region. Stay with us. Welcome back to A-News. Now, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan has met with Russian Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu in Moscow as part of his working visits to Russia. According to Turkish Foreign Ministry sources, the two discussed regional and international issues. Fidan is also expected to meet Russian President Vladimir Putin, according to a Kremlin foreign policy aide. Now, regional military cooperation is once again in the spotlight as Georgia, Turkey, and Azerbaijan launch a joint special operations exercise on Georgian soil. The Caucasian Eagle 2026 brings together elite forces from all three countries for joint field training. It's yet another event that raises or proves that defense ties in the South Caucasus continue to deepen. Our correspondent has more.
The Caucasian Eagle 2026 is not a one-off event. It is held every year and the host is rotated between Georgia, Turkey and Azerbaijan. This year it's Georgia's turn. The joint operation will show off each country's capabilities with special operation units from Georgia, Turkey and Azerbaijan undertaking joint field drills. The opening ceremony took place on Wednesday at the Major Galachedia Special Operations Training Center in Mukhrovani. Senior defense and diplomatic officials from all three countries were in attendance, underlining the political way behind the exercise. Georgia's Deputy Chief of Defense Forces and the commander of its Special Operations Forces addressed participants alongside representatives from the Turkish and Azerbaijani militaries. The goal is a practical one: better coordination between the three forces, stronger interoperability, and a shared experience in small units, tactics, and operational tasks. A joint evaluation team with representatives from all three nations will assess the training as it continues. In 2027, the exercise is expected to move to either Turkey or Azerbaijan, continuing the training cycle that has become a regular feature of trilateral defense cooperation in the South Caucasus. Nini Nikolaishvili, Tbilisi, A-News.
Now, the second day of the Islamic Development Bank Group annual meeting in Baku has seen a major push for economic diversification, high-value investment deals, and private sector expansion, with tens of millions of dollars in fresh agreements already signed. On the sidelines of the forum, Azerbaijan is strengthening its position as a strategic business hub for the region.
And financial center. Well, by collective action.
Day two here at the ISDB forum in Baku, and things are moving incredibly fast. ISDB Group President Muhammad Al-Jassir just opened the private sector session, and he pointed out exactly why Baku is the perfect hub right now. It's because the dialogue here is turning into actual practical business, and we are already seeing the paperwork to prove it. A series of new deals worth over $212 million just crossed the table. We are talking about a fresh partnership between the ISD and SOCAR, plus a $118 million boost directly to the Azerbaijan Business Development Fund to help local private companies grow.
During the opening session, we had signed 5 agreements specifically from the Islamic Cooperation for Development of Private Sector, ICD, with different Azerbaijan institutions. We had MOU with SOCAR to explore and develop financing opportunity for energy sector and also for renewable. We signed also with the Azerbaijan Business Development Foundation, also a framework to open opportunity for resource mobilization in Azerbaijan and also in the region.
By 2030.
and $2.7 billion.
But that's just a fraction of the bigger picture. Minister of Economy Mikhail Jabarov dropped a much larger figure today. He expects over 32 agreements worth upwards of $4.7 billion to be signed through this annual meeting. The core focus here, pushing hard into the non-oil sector, specifically green energy and logistics.
What I have noticed is that the Azerbaijan economy is going in a path of diversification of its industrial economic base. So food and food processing, agricultural food processing is a key element of that diversification policy or we say initiative. So ITFC can work with institutions, the relevant institutions in Azerbaijan to put up adequate financing model that would suit the requirement of the SME oriented toward export, building their resilience.
And income gaps with developed nations are built in many ways like coming home. The middle income.
Well, the event runs until June 19th and will keep you covered as more deals come through. Reporting from the ISDB forum in Baku, I am Leyla Rahimli, together with our camera operator Ilkin Mehdiev for A News.
Now, Tashkent has stepped forward as a center of investment diplomacy. This week, leaders, investors and representatives from major international financial institutions are gathering for the 5th Tashkent International Investment Forum. This year, it has brought together more than 8,000 guests, half of them coming in from over 100 countries, including heads of states, prime ministers and development banks. Our correspondent has more.
Tashkent is putting itself on the global financial map in a big way. This year's International Investment Forum has brought together more than 8,300 participants, the most since the forum started 5 years ago. This year, the forum hopes to exceed $30 billion in investment and trade agreements that were made last year. Addressing the forum's plenary session, President Shavkat Mirziyoyev outlined 6 priorities for the country's next stage of economic development, from strengthening investor protections and expanding capital markets to attracting investment into strategic industries, green energy, artificial intelligence, transport connectivity and urban development. The president also announced new initiatives, including the creation of the Tashkent International Financial Center, plans to issue sovereign Islamic bonds, and the expansion of privatization programs. It also has plans to attract greater investment into critical minerals, renewable energy, digital technologies, and major infrastructure projects.
The legal framework of the centre will be enshrined in a constitutional law. An attractive tax system will be created for the centre's participants. Profit tax, value-added tax, property tax, and customs duties will be set at 0%. The free movement of capital and the ability to conduct settlements in any currency will be fully guaranteed.
The forum's significance was reinforced by unprecedented level of political participation.
A sign of this is the growing international interest in Uzbekistan as a reliable and promising partner. That is why the Tashkent International Investment Forum attracts more representatives of governments, business circles, and international financial institutions every year. Azerbaijan, in turn, also views such initiatives as an important tool for strengthening international investment cooperation.
The discussions come as Uzbekistan continues to post strong economic indicators. The country has attracted more than $150 billion in foreign investment in recent years. The economy expanded by over 7.5% last year, while investment inflows reached $43 billion. International reserves now exceed $70 billion, and Uzbekistan's GDP is expected to surpass $180 billion this year. It is Tivit Hojab reporting from Tashkent, Uzbekistan, A News.
All right, that's all we have for now. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to A News.